So, you want to see my process for recreating models in Hayao Miyazaki's renowned Ghibli movies such as Howl's Moving Castle? Well, I'm currently doing this massive recreation project of the entirety of the castle, so let's take a closer look at my modeling progress, how it's going, and how we can render some very cool scenes from different points of view in this castle. Now let's not waste any time and let's get right into it. Now, aside from the obvious importance of looking at relevant reference imagery to get an idea for what you're making, let's get more detailed with some actionable steps which you can actually take in your own projects. I would first suggest to try and isolate aspects which you want to express and focus on, and you can work on these aspects separately. In this case, the brickwork can be done through modeling instead of texturing because I want to emphasize it. We can see in the reference imagery there is the cute roof section, and then we've got the mirrored design language and the slotted together pieces of curved metal underneath. Now we're able to work on all of these things separately and assemble them bit by bit. Proportions are probably the most important thing here, but you can usually afford to skim on detail a little bit. In terms of this process, you can see that I usually just start with blocks. I put them roughly in the areas where I want the details to be, and then I come in later on, and then I just basically create the model in full detail and then move on to the next bit. By choosing to do the bricks as models instead of just a texture, it certainly takes a lot more time, but I get a lot more fine control, and it looks a lot more like the reference image where bricks can actually stick out in a much more kind of quirky way. You can obviously achieve this with a texture and a displacement map, but it's kind of hard to find a texture which looks this wacky, and it's probably actually faster to just do this as a model. You can see that the model that I have created looks quite different in a lot of ways from the reference image, but I feel like the overall feel is still captured. Now, my next tip is actually quite transformative to the overall modeling approach, but before we get to that, I would like to mention that this project is nearing completion, and once it does, it will be available on my Ko-Fi, which you can see here, and also on my CG Trader to purchase. This will be an exciting time, and it will allow you guys to create your own awesome Ghibli or steampunk renders, using this very detailed model which I do plan on rigging, and it will also allow you guys to support me. Now, back to the point. Now, throughout this specific modeling process, there will be a lot of time spent zooming in. I literally just told you guys in the last step to focus on finishing individual aspects, move on to the next thing. To balance this approach, which is certainly nice for getting through things bit by bit, it is very important to zoom out and look at the picture as a whole and make sure that you're still nailing the atmosphere and the behaviors that you want to convey. A more simple way of thinking of this is, how is your object or scene going to work in the real world or in the imagined world which you're creating your object for? This is very important, and I have failed all too many times because I simply forget about this, get too tunnel visioned in creating all of those little aspects and ticking off this to-do list. To me, it's like marking an art piece or a piece of creative writing with a set of criteria that you're just ticking off. Sure, it's an approach that you can take to kind of standardize things, however, it's not going to really give you a very flexible or nuanced look at how the thing works. Just because I have nailed all the aspects and all the measurements does not mean that it's going to be conducive to a good looking model when you actually start taking renders of it and looking at it as a piece on its own. I want to actually show you guys an example because I made a tutorial on recreating pieces of 2D art as 3D models a while ago, and I honestly do think that while many of the words that I said in that video were accurate, the final result that I created myself was pretty damn awful. So bad in fact that I didn't even use it in the short film which I was making it for. Here is the model that you can see I was talking about. This is a revolver meant to be from the 2D game Barotrauma. However, my process for this was simply focused around a orthographic 2D image, and what I was focusing on was making sure the shapes matched exactly. I was making sure each piece kind of lined up with the image, but I was just losing sight of the goal, and the final model, as many people said, looks super blocky and just unusable. And as long as you're not actually working with a 3D model that you can orbit around, you are going to have to fill in details. And if you flail around like I did, kind of just bury your head in the ground and just work with what you've got and don't think critically for yourself at all about how everything's meant to fit together and kind of move around, like how this is going to work in a human hand, you're going to get a pretty sloppy sort of result like this. You can see a more recent result, which is a very silly looking revolver. However, you can see just how much more usable and better this looks. This was made off of, again, a single reference image. However, I did not constrain myself to only looking at the angles which that image showed. I made educated guesses and assumptions as to how the other side of the model would look like. And yes, the result is far from a very polished model. However, it was made in several hours, it took less time than the previous model, and it looks a whole lot better in many ways. The shape and the proportions are so much more accurate to the real thing, and when you orbit in 3D, it doesn't look like a block that has been extruded. There are actually holes for the bullets to go. I spent time about thinking how the cylinder could rotate. I invented this little inner bit connecting the different cylinders together. Probably wouldn't work in real life, but at least I thought of it. Just think critically, and don't be constrained by what you're using as reference. There's a balance between using the reference imagery to get good proportions and good art direction so that you can nail the feel, and then using it too much and kind of religiously following exactly what you can see, because that's not going to result in something that looks very good. How is somebody going to hold this handle, which is tiny in proportion to the gun, and also just looks so blocky and uncomfortable? How is a finger going to fit inside this trigger guard to pull this trigger when it's so thick and there's just so little space in there? How is the cylinder going to hold any bullets when there's literally just like, there's no even implication of a place for bullets to go here? It doesn't look like it'll rotate. This barrel, way too like strange looking. It looks like a Nerf gun or a gun from Fortnite or something. Obviously, if you're making something cartoon-like, the approach is going to be a little bit different, but even then, you're going to be thinking, how does this work in the game world? And this is just not in any way look like a very good product. And forgetting about how it's going to look when you start rotating around and having to fill in the details that you aren't shown in the reference imagery, that is the key thing. Obviously, for recreating stuff like a tire model or like a product, you can get these nice sort of like orbit view shots, side profiles, top downs, front on shots, and you can get a quite good idea of what all of the different aspects of the model look like. However, at the end of the day, they are 2D reference images. You can see in this reference imagery that this roof bit looks like it's all kind of put together and that there's just little seams going along. However, my approach with this was quite different, and I just thought, okay, I don't really know what the texture looks like on this reference image. I don't really have a reference for how this is all going to look together, so I'm just going to make my own approach and think, how could this work in a way in the real world? And so I just took these kind of metal pieces and I just assembled them layer by layer. There's going to be this sort of like overhang over the door. Sort of welcome sign is just an invented aspect which I came up with, but I just wanted something to fill in the space, and I'm just platform out front. Then I can start focusing on all the small things like the little kind of broken railing that we can see in the movie, a little pot sitting outside which I can see in a reference image. But because we kind of focused on nailing those aspects one by one in that first step that we talked about, everything's looking pretty up to scratch, and then I can just zoom out, take a look at the image as a whole, see what needs adjusting. I think that I moved around some of the bricks a bit. I retextured some things definitely while I was zooming out because I realized that not everything was going to mesh together really well. Alright, now regarding the environment, I may make a separate video on the Ghibli environments in the future, and I don't want this video to end up being too long, so I'll just cover it briefly here. I would say that it all boils down to a simple thing: colors. If you look at Hayao Miyazaki works and backgrounds until your eyes start to glaze over, get a feel for the colors that are going to kind of align with your chosen setting, and just make sure that everything in your environment is kind of conducive to nailing that aspect. This is obviously a sort of realistic interpretation on Studio Ghibli, so I wouldn't say that it looks all too good compared to Ghibli's actual works. However, having just a fitting looking environment I think is enough in most cases. This is not quite done yet. You can see a lot of what I'm going for here, and I'll get into explaining how that all works in a future video. I am planning on making my submission for Clint Jones's new Kinetic Rush month-long render challenge a Ghibli-themed one, and hopefully including this model plotting around as a main background element. So look forward to that, some challenge updates. I'd highly recommend going to check out the challenge, but like a weekend, I haven't really started working on the actual challenge, but I guess I am working on the model, so it's sort of like conducive to that. But thanks so much for watching, guys. Your support is greatly appreciated. I must give a special shout out to Dylan Heislett for being the first Elite Blender Samurai subscriber. You get access to this video early. I'll also be making a poll shortly, which you'll be able to vote on. You get access to special Discord roles, icons, and more, but primarily your support is just greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for all of my other supporters listed here. You guys are the best, and you make making these videos a lot more feasible for me. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one. It's been Yizin. Goodbye.